For this chapter on the endocrine system, we're going to begin by looking at an overview of the system, considering its overall functions and a big picture of the structures that are involved. In an overview of the endocrine system, we're going to consider the major glands that are usually associated with it, as well as discuss that other organs contain endocrine functions, though they usually get left out of a strict list of portions of the system. Also, we want to consider the major functions of the endocrine system, which are, as you can see at the top of this slide, regulation and growth and development. Now, really, the two of those are intertwined quite a bit, but as an endocrine function, growth and development is a special kind of regulation that we want to consider. The endocrine system is one of the two major components of handling homeostasis in the body, and so regulation is its major function. It does things from regulating the circadian rhythms, just our internal awareness of night versus day, or the 24-hour clock, to regulating numerous concentrations of electrolytes in our body, to regulating how we use energy and the various metabolic processes in our body. It's in charge of controlling cardiac and smooth muscle contractions for the most part, as well as glandular secretions. Those two, of course, it shares with the autonomic system, the other component of homeostasis. And then finally, it's responsible for aspects of immune physiology. As I said before, growth and development really are just a special aspect of regulation, not so obviously homeostasis, of keeping things in an equilibrium, in balance, so much as the dynamic processes that give rise to the adult body structure. We will look a bit more closely at how there's an endocrine control of bone and organ growth, and to separate it out that way is really to highlight the role of making long bones longer, but really it's making everything in the body grow to its adult size. In the next chapter, when we look at the blood, we'll consider hematopoiesis, which is under endocrine control. We won't look at it now, but it's another aspect of growth and development. And then we'll also save the reproductive physiology aspect of endocrinology for when we get to the reproductive system, and the immune development component for that chapter. Most textbooks and other sources will approach talking about the anatomy of the endocrine system, usually by laying out generally these 10 particular structures that are associated with it as the endocrine glands. Actually, in this picture, only 9 things are highlighted, but there is a 10th very important portion, which I'll explain in a second. Going through the list of these structures involved in the endocrine system, I want to begin with the most superior located of them and then move my way through the body. So to begin with, there's the pineal gland. The name pineal gland is referring to the fact that it's shaped like a pine cone, and it's responsible for really just one thing. It's responsible for releasing melatonin, which is a hormone that indicates to the body when it's nighttime. The pineal gland is responsible for regulating the circadian rhythms in the body. It receives input through the hypothalamus that light is hitting the retina. That light needs to be broad spectrum white light, meaning sunlight, and when the light levels go down, as it would with night, the pineal gland starts to secrete melatonin. Tying this into the visual stimulus through sunlight, helps to set our circadian rhythms with the diurnal cycle of day and night. Without external input, the pineal gland would probably run at a different length of cycle, maybe 26 hours or something to that effect. The next thing I want to mention isn't expressly pointed out in this picture, and that's the hypothalamus. It is in this picture. The bracket to the side is locating the level at which the thalamus would be found, and so the hypothalamus is below that. If you can kind of squint and look at this picture and see, I don't know, a strange looking rooster, the beak-like structure, the two kind of pointy things that are at the bottom of the bracket, those are parts of the hypothalamus. The rooster's wattle, I think you call it, the thing hanging out underneath the beak that's shaded in here, is another structure. The hypothalamus is superior to that other structure, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, the hypothalamus is responsible for coordinating homeostatic mechanisms through the body. It does that both through coordination of the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. So it's not strictly an endocrine structure, but it is important for coordinating a lot of endocrine function. And the way that it does that is through the pineal gland, which is that shaded structure beneath the beak-like structure that I'm pointing out in this picture. The pituitary gland receives regulatory input from the hypothalamus in the form of hormones that are released directly onto it. And then it sends out its own set of hormones that can regulate other structures within the endocrine system. Not everything in the endocrine system is regulated this way, but a lot of the master control of the system does take place through the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. And there will be a section later on specifically on that hypothalamus-pituitary axis and how it controls things. Moving out of the cranial space down into the throat, the next structure to mention is the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland sits at the base of the larynx and wraps around from the anterior side onto either lateral aspect of the upper trachea, lower larynx, and actually doesn't quite meet posteriorly in the back as the inset here suggests, but it tapers off and the two lobes don't quite meet in the middle. The thyroid gland is responsible for releasing three major hormones, two of which are often referred to as the thyroid hormones, and they're responsible for regulating metabolism. They are T3 and T4, as we'll refer to them for the most part. And then it also releases a third hormone called calcitonin, and hopefully from the name it's obvious that calcitonin is related to calcium homeostasis. On the posterior side of the thyroid gland, which is what the inset is suggesting, there are the parathyroid glands. In this picture, they're shown as 4 spots on the posterior side of the thyroid. They are variable in number from person to person, but generally speaking, the amount of parathyroid tissue will be fairly constant. So one person could have 4 large glands, another person could have 8 smaller glands. But as long as the overall tissue is consistent, the function will be pretty much the same from person to person. Now, the parathyroid glands secrete only one hormone named the parathyroid hormone, or PTH, as we'll be referring to it. With calcitonin, PTH plays a part in calcium homeostasis, and there will be a section later on specifically on that endocrine mechanism. Also in this inset here, or not inset, in this picture, just inferior to the thyroid gland, further down on the trachea in the picture, is the thymus gland. This is important for development and function in the immune system, and so we'll really consider it in terms of that. When you look at your average anatomical model for human anatomy and physiology, which is showing an adult structure, you usually don't see the thymus gland present. It interferes with a direct view of the heart, which is often thought to be one of the more important organs. So the thymus is usually left out. And that actually kind of fits in the adult situation. The thymus isn't usually active. It's only part of development. And by the time somebody's full grown, it's become mostly fatty tissue. We'll be talking about that when we get to the immune system chapter later. Continuing down in the inferior direction, next we come to the adrenal glands. The word adrenal means, from the Latin, on top of the kidney. You may find reference to it as the suprarenal gland, which is just another name used in more modern circumstances, but adrenal is perfectly acceptable. The adrenal glands came up in the autonomic system because the adrenal medulla is part of the fight or flight response. We'll be concentrating on the adrenal cortex as an endocrine structure, although they both really are releasing hormones into the system. And then next we have the pancreas. Now the pancreas is actually mostly a digestive organ. It's responsible for making many digestive juices for the small intestine. But it gets pretty high billing, so to speak, in the endocrine system because of its importance in regulating blood sugar level and the fact that it's where insulin comes from, and many people are probably familiar with diabetes, a pretty well-known condition. But really it's not primarily an endocrine gland. Finally, we come to the reproductive organs. The ovaries, which are obviously female, and testes, which are obviously male, are analogous structures in that they're both the reproductive glands, responsible for making the primary sex hormones. In this picture, they list the uterus also. They point that out. It's not a gland in the same sense, but it is an organ that has important endocrine functions, as it releases hormones that help to regulate many features of gestation and pregnancy. All of these, of course, we'll be talking about in more detail when we get to the reproductive system at the end of the course. Now, having looked at these particular organs that are associated with the endocrine function, I do want to mention that there are a number of other organs that are important too, that are left out in this picture, usually because their primary functions are non-endocrine and their endocrine functions seem to be minor. Now, with that definition, you would think that the pancreas shouldn't be included here because it's primarily a digestive gland. But, like I said earlier, the pancreas is fairly well known for its endocrine function. But, for instance, the heart releases some hormones and the kidneys release hormones, both of which help to regulate blood pressure and are integral in taking care of that particular homeostatic mechanism. The digestive tract, stomach and intestines especially, release a number of hormones that help to regulate digestive function. We'll be dealing with those functions as they come up later in the course, but I do want to mention that there's more to endocrine function in the endocrine system than just the ones that we're going to focus on in this unit. It's just these are the main ones, and they are great for illustrating some features of endocrine function. In considering an overview of the endocrine system, it's also useful at this point to consider the roles of the nervous and endocrine systems in communication within your body. So this table from the book just compares the endocrine and nervous systems in a number of different ways. The signaling mechanisms are chemical in the endocrine system, and then a mixture of chemical and electrical in the nervous system, obviously. The primary chemical signals are called hormones in the endocrine system and neurotransmitters in the nervous system. Now, actually, they can be the exact same chemicals. Depending on where you look, certain chemicals are used in the endocrine system and the nervous system, and how they're implemented makes a difference. For example, and this is something from the autonomic system section of the course, but norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter that we find released from postganglionic sympathetic fibers. It's also a hormone released from the adrenal medulla. It's not the primary one, epinephrine is, but it is being released from the adrenal medulla. The best way to sort of describe what makes something a hormone versus a neurotransmitter, when in fact the same chemical could be considered as either, hormones we usually think of as being involved in purely chemical signals, mostly that travel through the bloodstream, or there are a couple of other ways of thinking of how they move through the body, but primarily through the bloodstream, whereas neurotransmitters are found released from axon terminals into a synapse, onto a very particular target that's right at that synapse also. Moving through the bloodstream, hormones can go far afield, but coming from a synapse, they really are limited in their area of action. And that's sort of reflected in the distance traveled aspect. A gland might release a hormone actually not even into the bloodstream, but into the local bodily fluid, interstitial fluid, for instance, and could be affecting the next cell over. But just as easily it could leave, the pituitary gland and affect the gonads. So, long or short. In the nervous system, since we're talking about synapses, it's always short. Response time also depends on the situation for the endocrine system. And then in the nervous system, the response time is always quite fast. The environment targeted for the endocrine system, it's internal equilibrium, it's homeostasis, obviously. For the nervous system, some aspects are internal homeostatic mechanisms, like with the autonomic system, but others are external, mostly the somatic nervous system aspects, where we are perceiving the world around us and reacting to it. I want to introduce asking questions into the presentation to some degree, and so let me start that off here with this one, which is what structure is responsible for coordinating homeostasis through both the autonomic and endocrine systems. The answer to that is the hypothalamus. It's responsible for coordinating the autonomic system and supplying information and coordinating the endocrine system. The autonomic system, being part of the nervous system, is getting direct input from nuclei in the hypothalamus. The endocrine system is getting input through hormones that are released by the hypothalamus that then mostly influence the anterior pituitary gland. And we'll have a section specifically on that in a little bit.